Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Inshallah, we'll continue with our reading of Imam al-Nawawi's Etiquette with the Quran, Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran. Yesterday, we got into the 6th chapter of the book, where he talks about specific etiquette of recitation. And yesterday, he mentioned that the first thing we need to do is we have to have ikhlas and we have to have ihsan. And he brought up some of the rulings related to using the toothstick or the miswak and some of the other things that can take its place. And he also talked about what do you do if your mouth is filthy? Do you recite or do you have to wash it out? Would it be offensive to read in that case, etc.? He talked about that. Then he talked about ritual purity. And he said that it is recommended to be in the state of ritual purity when reciting the Quran. Right? So we talked about that. And then he talked about major ritual impurity. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So yesterday he brought up some of the basic rulings about recitation and ritual, major ritual impurity. So what we're going to do today, right now, is going to be a continuation of some of the things that I said yesterday. So one moment. Okay, so today's segment is going to be a continuation of what Imam al-Nawawi said yesterday when he mentioned that it is unlawful for people in the state of major ritual impurification, yani janaba, which would be caused by intercourse or orgasm or having a wet dream or menstruation or nifas, to recite Quran whether it is a complete or a partial verse. And he mentioned that it's unlawful to recite this when one intends recitation, but then he brought up the exceptional case of verses and parts of the Quran that are used as supplication and adhkar. So like the dua that we would say when we get into our car or ride a bus or a plane, because it's intended as supplication, as dua, it's considered permissible to still recite even if one cannot recite Quran. So if someone has a daily collection of adhkar that they read, like let's say the wird of Imam al-Nawawi or one of the other various awrad that people read, if it contains a bit of Quran, it would still be permissible for a woman to read during her menses, provided she intends it as dua and adhkar and not as recitation of the Quran. So he talked about those things yesterday. Okay, so when one has major ritual impurification, janaba, or someone's period ends or their nifas ends, it's unlawful for them to recite Quran, that's the general rule, until they make ghusl. And once they make ghusl, these things become permissible for them to do again. Okay, this is covered in basic fiqh related to purification. Okay, but what do they do if they don't have water or they can't use it? What would we do in that case? Well, in that case, they would resort to tayammum. Right? And tayammum, or dry ablution, is a weak form of ritual purification that can be used in place of water, in place of wudu and ghusl in times of necessity. Times of necessity meaning that someone doesn't have access to water or they have access to it but they can't use it. So either they don't have any water at all, they're in the middle of the desert and they run out of water, or they only have enough water for themselves, or water is present but they can't use it. So water is present, it's down in the river, and there's a whole pack of alligators and anacondas and piranhas that are preventing you from using the water. Well, if that's the case, then the water might as well not even exist, right? Or they're barred from using the water because they're sick. Say someone who has really bad eczema, or someone who has cuts on their hand, and if they got water on it, it would make the problem worse, or it could even cause it to become infected and then get gangrene, and then they'd have to amputate the arm, etc., etc. Okay, so when you have cases like that, then we don't use the water. Instead, we'd use dry ablution. And there's a lot of details about dry ablution or tayammum covered in the books of fiqh, but we're only going to stick to what we need to what we need to know in order to read the parts that Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring. So, tayammum or dry ablution is a weak form of ritual purification that can be used in place of wudu or ghusl in times of necessity. It is considered weak because it doesn't actually lift the state of impurification, but it rather gives us a license to perform acts requiring purification. And because the license is limited and invalidated by things that would not invalidate ablution. Okay, so tayammum is a weaker form of ritual purification. It's a weak form. It's not as strong as wudu. It's not as strong as ghusl. And when we say not as strong, it's because it's going to be invalidated by things the others are not going to be validated. And also because it's not as strong, there are some things that we can do with those that we can't do when we make tayammum. So the real important things that we need to know for the section that we're going to read today is that tayammum doesn't actually raise the state of ritual impurity. When you make tayammum, it doesn't remove the state of janaba. It doesn't remove the state of hadath. Those are still there. And one of the proofs we have of this is that if you use tayammum because you don't have water and then you suddenly see water, well, then you're going to have to go use the water for ablution, which is an indicator that you didn't actually remove the state of impurification, okay? So it doesn't actually raise the state of impurification, and tayammum has to be repeated with each obligatory prayer. So every time you're going to pray an obligatory prayer, you're going to have to make tayammum. But once you've made that tayammum, you can make a number of non-obligatory prayers. Now, there's still conditions about this, but the essential thing we need to know is that it would have to be repeated for each obligatory prayer. And also, we need to know that tayammum can be invalidated when one sees water, okay? We need to know those things now because Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring up some things that are based on having that knowledge. Now, I mentioned that tayammum is out of necessity, and something we need to note is that whenever rulings are related to necessity, so for example, when necessity renders something that is otherwise unlawful lawful, it would only be limited to what is actually required by necessity. So for example, if someone is on the verge of starvation and the only thing that they have to eat around them is a pack of pork hot dogs. So they've got a pack of pork hot dogs, and one of them would be enough to keep them from dying. Well, they can eat one, they can't eat all 10. Why? Because the permissibility of eating that otherwise unlawful meat is reversed only to the extent that necessity calls for. Okay, why does that matter here? Because if we say that tayammum is out of necessity, then we're going to know that if we say that you can use tayammum to pray out of necessity, that not everything around prayer and not everything that ghusl or wudu would render permissible will necessarily be rendered permissible by tayammum. It's a big mouthful, isn't it? Okay, so another thing that we're going to talk about today is that in the absence of water, one would make tayammum, right? But what do you do if you don't have access to dirt for making tayammum? That also has to be covered. Okay, so going back to the necessity thing, people disagree over what's necessity and what's necessary. Okay. What would actually render a ruling? What would flip a ruling? What are the circumstances under which a ruling would be flipped? This has to do with necessity. What are the things that are necessary for us to do? because those are the things that necessity could flip and have an effect on. Okay, so we're going to talk about prayer. When we say that tayammum permits it for us to make prayer when we otherwise wouldn't be able to get purification, does it allow us to do everything in prayer or just some things in prayer? That's one of the things Imam al-Nawawi is about to get into. Okay, so enough of an introduction. It's been long enough for people to get the notice from Facebook that I'm going to continue reading. So here we go. I know that the title suggests that it's going to be like a complete section about dry ablution, and it's not really a part of the previous discussion, but it really is. The section here on dry ablution and then the section on in the absence of water and earth, these deal with things specific to major ritual impurification and menstruation. Okay, so Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah says, an individual with major ritual impurity, janaba, or menstruation may make dry ablution, tayammum, in the absence of water. Okay, absence of water here, like I mentioned, we're talking about the actual absence of water. It does not exist for you. So it's physically non-existent or legally non-existent. Legally meaning that even though it exists, there is something else that prevents you from using it. Prevents you, like what? The alligators and the piranhas down by the river that would beat you off if you tried to take their water. Or a skin condition that would get worse, or an injury that would get infected if you used water. Okay, so an individual with major ritual impurity or menstruation may make dry ablution, tayammum, in the absence of water. Then it is lawful to recite Quran, pray, and perform other things that require ritual purity. But if thereafter one were to have major ritual impurity, it is unlawful to pray, but not unlawful, but if thereafter one were to have minor ritual impurity, it is unlawful to pray, but not unlawful to recite Quran, to sit in the mosque, or other things lawful for someone in a state of minor ritual impurity. Okay, so the rulings, the basic ruling here is that someone needs to make tayammum. That one act of tayammum lifts, it allows you to do the things that you are barred from doing while in the state of janaba, for example. Okay, so someone who just had sex or their menstruation ended and then they made tayammum, they would now be allowed to pray. And let's say they passed wind. Well, they couldn't pray again, but they would still be allowed to recite the Quran. Okay, because tayammum for major ritual impurification will still cover some things, but not cover everything. It's really complicated when we get into exceptions to exceptions. Okay, so an individual with major ritual impurity or menstruation may make dry ablution in the absence of water. Then it is lawful to recite Quran, pray, and perform other things that require ritual purity, because it's acting just as though the person had made ghusl, right? But thereafter, so after they make that ghusl, if they were to have minor ritual impurity, it becomes unlawful for them to pray, but not unlawful for them to recite Quran, sit in the mosque, or other things lawful for someone in a state of minor ritual impurity. Why? Because the tayammum here is acting very, very similar to what ghusl would do. So if someone made ghusl, they can now pray and they can now recite Quran, right? Well, what if they then pass gas? Well, they can't pray anymore, but they could still recite the Quran. And just like ghusl, we're going to say tayammum operates the same way. So if someone made tayammum or ghusl and afterwards had minor ritual impurity, we would say it's unlawful for them to pray, but it is not unlawful for them to recite Quran, to sit in a mosque, or other things lawful to someone in a state of minor ritual impurity. Okay. Why? Because he is considered like a person who made the purificatory bath, ghusl, and then had minor ritual impurity. Okay, so this is how they reason it out. And now Imam al-Nawawi is going to mention an issue that is asked about and it is considered rare. Now, something you got to keep in mind here is that tayammum doesn't actually remove the state of ritual impurity. And one of the proofs of that I mentioned is that if you see water, you're then required to use it. Okay, so he's going to come, Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring up a rare thing, and it's kind of like a puzzle that people would sometimes bring up. And he said, it is said, what is a scenario in which a person in major ritual impurity is barred from praying, but not barred from reciting the Quran or sitting in the mosque without necessity? And the foregoing is such a scenario. So, someone makes tayammum after because of janaba or the end of menstruation. They make tayammum. They're now allowed to pray. They're now allowed to recite the Quran. And they're now allowed to sit in the mosque, right? So they're allowed to do these things even though their purification hasn't actually been, their state of impurification hasn't actually been lifted. Okay, that's what he's talking about right here. It's a little bit confusing. It's somewhat of a weird issue, but it's what you get. You get cases like this when you... Well, why do you get cases like this? Okay, so what happens is when our fiqh leads us to solid answers, we will sometimes have scenarios come up that have somewhat counterintuitive rulings, where if you know the underlying fiqh, it makes sense, but without that fiqh, you probably wouldn't have gotten to that answer. And this comes up with a lot of issues. People sometimes bring up things, it's like, well, how could the Imam say this? Well, maybe he said what seems really counterintuitive and weird because it's related to something that he has very solid fiqh about. And having that solid fiqh, one of its consequences is we end up with this weird answer. Okay, so I'm not going to get into that right now. Regarding this issue, there is no difference between making dry ablution while resident or traveling. If you read fiqh about dry ablution, about tayammum, one of the things you're going to realize is that we're going to differentiate in many cases between someone who's resident and someone who's traveling, because people who are resident, they're assumed to have access to water, because people tend to live in areas where water is readily accessible throughout the year. And there's some other things. So anyways, he says that regarding this issue, there is no difference between making dry ablution while resident or traveling. And some of the followers of Imam Shafi have mentioned that if one makes dry ablution while resident, it is lawful to pray, but he may not recite Quran outside of prayer nor sit in the mosque. Okay, so Imam al-Nawawi here brings up another opinion, and he said that some of the followers of Imam Shafi mentioned that if one makes dry ablution while resident, it is lawful to pray, but he may not recite Quran outside of prayer nor sit in the mosque. Why? Because if you really need to make dry ablution and you're in a situation where you really shouldn't need to make it, then we're going to say that it doesn't permit everything that it would permit if you were like totally excused. This is the argument they're making. So you have to pray because prayer is a daily obligation, right? There's 5 prayers that we're required to pray every day. But we're not required to sit in a mosque. If you're a male, you might be required to enter the mosque to pray. Well, wait. Congregational prayer is required, but praying in a mosque isn't. Okay? So what the fuqaha who follow this position say is that, all right, if you're going to be required to make tayammum, if necessity requires you to make tayammum, all you can do are the things that are absolutely necessary. Yes, you have to pray, but you don't have to recite Quran outside of prayer. And if you do have to pray prayer in congregation, you don't have to do the congregation in a mosque. And because the mosque has restricted rulings about when you can be in it, you're not going to be able to have an exception to it. So we have this line of argument that supports an opinion within the madhab that if you are resident and make tayammum, for major ritual impurity, you're allowed to pray, but you're not going to be allowed to recite the Quran outside of prayer, and you're not going to be allowed to sit in the mosque. This is the second position that Imam al-Nawawi mentions. It's a second position. And I explained why it would be reasonable to make that argument. So Imam al-Nawawi mentions this second position, which does have a reasonable and an understandable argument, and then he says, but the sound position is that reciting is permissible, as we previously mentioned. Okay, he mentioned that someone who makes tayammum in place of ghusl will be given the same rulings as someone who did make ghusl. So they can still pray, they can still recite Quran, even if they then lose wudu, and they can sit in the mosque. So even though the tayammum doesn't actually lift the state of ritual impurity, we're still going to allow them to behave as though they had made ghusl. Okay, so when you review this later on, the thing you need to concentrate on is what is the soundest opinion that Imam al-Nawawi gave. And it was the foregoing position, right? That reciting is permissible, sitting in the mosque would be permissible. Now, if one were to make dry ablution, pray, recite, and then saw water, he must use the water for ghusl, since it is unlawful for him to recite or perform anything unlawful for one with major ritual impurity until making the purificatory bath. Now, you would get a hint of this in the fiqh books, but in the fiqh books they mainly talk about prayer, about the impact of seeing water after you made tayammum, and they would restrict that impact to prayer. But because Imam al-Nawawi is talking about rulings dealing with recitation and with the Quran, he's going to bring up some of the consequences that have to do with that. So he focuses more on that. So he says, if one were to make dry ablution, if one were to make tayammum, and then pray and recite, and then see water. So after he prayed and after he recited, and he's done doing those, he then sees water. He's going to have to use that water to make ghusl, and his tayammum is now gone, since it is unlawful for him to recite or perform anything unlawful for one with janaba until making the purification bath. So just as seeing water outside of prayer would require you to make ghusl instead of tayammum, seeing water when you aren't reciting would require you to make ghusl instead of tayammum. Now, there's going to be some more details to this. If we go back to a book of fiqh, including Imam al-Nawawi's books of fiqh, we're going to see there's some conditions, like it's someone who is making tayammum because of the absence of water, not because of the incapacity, the inability to use it. Okay, so if you made tayammum because of the crocodile and piranha infested river situation, and you then saw water that you can use, you're going to have to use it. But if the reason that you made dry ablution is because of a medical condition, then if someone brings you more water, it doesn't matter. You would continue to use ghusl. So Imam al-Nawawi brings the general ruling, and it's something that we can expand on and flesh out by going and looking at the section in bigger fiqh books. Anyway, if one were to make dry ablution, pray, recite, and then saw water, he must use it for a purificatory bath, since it is unlawful for him to recite or perform anything unlawful for one with major ritual impurity, like prayer, until making the purificatory bath. If one were to make dry ablution, tayammum, and then pray, recite, and then wanted to make dry ablution again because of major ritual impurity, to prepare for another obligatory prayer or something else, it is not unlawful for him to recite Quran according to the sound preferred opinion. If one were to make dry ablution, and then pray, recite, and then wanted to make dry ablution again because of major ritual impurity, to perform another obligatory prayer or something else, it is not unlawful for him to recite Quran according to the sound preferred opinion. Some of the later companions of the Shafi hold the opinion that it is not permissible, but the well-known is the former. Okay. So he's talking about someone who has made tayammum, which only lasts. Tayammum can only be used for one obligatory prayer. So let's say that they used it. Can they continue to recite? The answer is yes. Okay, so that's the issue he's getting into there. So I mentioned that tayammum is what we do when we don't have access to water. So when we don't have access to water, but we do have access to pure dirt, we would look at making tayammum. Well, what are you going to do if you don't have access to either? You don't have access to pure water, to water that is pure and purifying, and you don't have access to dirt that is pure and purifying. What would you do? Now, this might seem like a really crazy scenario, right? But what about people who are in prisons? Someone who's in a holding cell might not have access to water or dirt that they could use for purification. So what are they going to do? When someone with major ritual impurity finds neither earth nor water with which to attain purification, he may perform prayer in spite of not having purification because of the constriction of the prayer's time range. So out of necessity, we would say that he goes ahead and he goes through the motions of prayer. We're ordered to pray during a particular time range. If we can't fulfill all of the conditions, we will still pray it as we can, though we may have to repeat it afterwards. We're still required to go through the motions, though. Okay, so he does so. He prays whatever his circumstances may be. It is unlawful, however, for him to recite Quran outside of the bounds of prayer, and during the prayer itself, it is unlawful for him to recite more than al-Fatiha. Okay, so suppose that someone has major ritual impurification, they have janaba, and they do not have water and they do not have earth with which to get some sort of purification. They do have to pray, though. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to pray according to whatever circumstances they can. So they're going to go ahead and they're going to carry out the actions of prayer. Great. Because they have to. But within prayer, they're only going to recite al-Fatiha because that's the only thing that's required of them to recite, and they're also not going to be allowed to recite anything outside of prayer. They're still in the state of janaba. They haven't done tayammum that would give them license to do the things that are unlawful. So we're going to say that out of the necessity of praying within the prayer time, we're going to allow them to pray, but only to recite the Quran that is necessary for prayer, and the only rukn related to recitation is reciting al-Fatiha. Okay? And outside of prayer, because they're not required to recite prayer, we're going to say that they're not allowed to. Because, why? They haven't made ghusl and they haven't made tayammum. So, this is the first ruling that he gives. Yet, is it unlawful for him to recite al-Fatiha? Okay, so let me wind back. He says, it is unlawful, however, for him to recite Quran outside of the bounds of prayer. This one's an obvious one because it's not necessary for him to do so. So why would we allow him to do so? It's only necessary for him to recite Quran inside of the prayer, right? And then Imam al-Nawawi says, and during the prayer itself, it is unlawful for him to recite more than al-Fatiha. Well, why even say al-Fatiha? Well, because it's a rukn according to the Shafi madhab. According to the Shafis, not only do you have to recite some Quran, but everyone has to recite al-Fatiha. Al-Fatiha is something that we specifically have to recite. Whether you're the Imam, or whether you're following an Imam, or whether you're praying alone, you're required to recite al-Fatiha. So it's pretty clear that if anything's going to be allowed inside of prayer, it's going to be al-Fatiha. But wait, is that really the only conclusion that we could have here? Would it be possible that it would remain unlawful for him to recite al-Fatiha? So Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring two opinions because, yeah, there is a reasonable argument that you don't need to recite al-Fatiha. Think about it, okay, just as a preamble here to make it easier. Someone enters Islam. So someone just entered Islam, and it's really easy for them to follow the motions of someone else in prayer. That's really easy for someone to learn to do. And it's really easy for them to memorize saying Allahu Akbar. So they can do all of, it's pretty easy for them to do a lot of the essential adhkar that they need to do just by memorizing Allahu Akbar and seeing the motions of prayer. Memorizing al-Fatiha is not so easy. It's not something you're going to do in 5 minutes. So what do we say to someone who hasn't memorized al-Fatiha and they have an excuse not for doing it? We tell them that they should bring up some other adhkar that they have, or that they should just pause for a certain amount of time. And Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring all of this in a little bit. The point, the important thing to get here is that we do have an alternative to reciting al-Fatiha for people who can't do it. Now, if that's the case, then why would someone who can't make tayammum and can't make wudu, why would we say that they have any reason to recite al-Fatiha even in prayer if they can bring an alternative? That's what Imam al-Nawawi is going to bring up now. Okay? So with that in mind, is it unlawful for him to recite al-Fatiha within prayer? If we have an alternative, does that mean it remains unlawful for him to recite? There are two opinions concerning this. The sound and the preferred opinion is that it is not unlawful, and in fact it's obligatory to recite al-Fatiha since prayer is invalid without it. Okay, because I mentioned that the Shafi madhab says that one of the arkan of prayer is the recitation of al-Fatiha. So if it's okay to pray in this situation, then it would mean that it's also okay to recite al-Fatiha in this situation. Why? Because al-Fatiha is specifically required as part of prayer. Okay, so just as it is permissible to perform prayer in spite of major ritual impurity, because it became critical at that moment, because time for the prayer is specific and it needs to be done inside that window of time in order for you to be seen as carrying out the obligation of standing in prayer for that prayer in that time. It is likewise permissible to recite al-Fatiha. So just as the limited time would allow us to pray in spite of not having ritual purity, we likewise would recite al-Fatiha because it itself is required in order for prayer to be valid. So if we're allowed to pray, actually we're required to pray, then we would also be required to recite al-Fatiha. That's the argument that Imam al-Nawawi presents here for the sound opinion. Now the second opinion is that it is not permissible. Rather, one says the adhkar that someone who is incapacitated, who has not memorized anything of the Quran, would say. So the second opinion is that reciting al-Fatiha in prayer remains impermissible. And instead, what one would do is it would say the adhkar that someone who has not memorized anything from the Quran would say. Okay, someone who hasn't memorized anything from the Quran, what we tell them is, all right, have you memorized Subhanallah? Have you memorized Alhamdulillah? Have you memorized some other adhkar? Bring them in its place and recite a number of letters that equal the letters of al-Fatiha. And if you can't do that, then just stand long enough that someone could have recited al-Fatiha. So the second opinion is that it is not permissible to recite al-Fatiha, but instead what someone would do is they would do what someone who can't recite Quran because they haven't memorized it, we would do what they would do. Okay, why? The reasoning he gives is that someone without water or earth is incapable of achieving purification. And according to the sacred law, they have become analogous to someone who is disabled from reciting al-Fatiha. So just as their inability to recite al-Fatiha makes it so that they would recite the alternative, we would say that someone who cannot obtain purification would do the same thing that they would do. So if inability to recite the Fatiha, al-Fatiha, means that you would move to other adhkar, then we would say that inability to get purification would mean that you would also drop al-Fatiha and you would go to adhkar that are not from the Quran. Okay. This is the second opinion that Imam al-Nawawi gives, and it does have a reasonable argument, but Imam al-Nawawi says the correct opinion is the first. Okay, so he says, is it unlawful for him to recite al-Fatiha? There are two opinions concerning this. The sound and preferred opinion is that it is not unlawful. So someone who cannot obtain purification from earth or water, in spite of being in the state of major ritual impurity, will still recite al-Fatiha when they pray. But they're not allowed to recite Quran outside of prayer, and within prayer they're not going to be allowed to recite anything other than al-Fatiha. Why? Because necessity requires them to pray in the time, and the requirements of prayer dictate that they must recite al-Fatiha. And whenever something is permitted due to necessity, we limit what it permits to what is actually called for by necessity, what's absolutely necessary. Okay, so I mentioned that if you're on the verge of starvation and one unlawful hot dog will do, you don't eat 10. And if you're in a situation where you can't obtain ritual purification by any means, you still have to pray because it's necessary, and out of that necessity, you will recite the part of the Quran that is required for your prayer to be valid, and that is al-Fatiha and nothing else. Okay. So Imam al-Nawawi then says these details that we have just mentioned are needed, and may Allah protect us from ever being in a situation where we need them for practical purposes, and thus I alluded to them with the most concise expressions. They have evidence in numerous supplements. There's lots and lots and lots of details about these things, and I mentioned a few of them while going through this material, and they are well known in the books of fiqh. And really, if you haven't done a little bit more than Fard al-Ain in fiqh, Imam al-Nawawi is going to be bringing material that you probably aren't going to grasp. So I really recommend, I highly recommend that you take your study of the fiqh that you need on your daily basis well beyond the Fard al-Ain state. And people who have studied enough to realize just how silly what I just said, good. Okay, if you need it, it's Fard al-Ain. So typically when we study Fard al-Ain, people think that it's just about purification, but not tayammum, because most of us don't need tayammum. And it's just about a few things of prayer. But it doesn't cover everything in prayer, because most of us don't live in places where we need drought. And fasting is only a few things. And when it comes to zakat, we're not going to cover cows and camels because we don't have cows and camels. And we're not even going to get into trade or anything else. A lot of people think that Fard al-Ain is just about the acts of worship that you yourself have to carry out, or that the vast majority of people have to carry out. Fard al-Ain is any knowledge that you need in your daily life. If you engage in trade, then it is Fard al-Ain for you to learn about the essentials of trade and how to avoid riba. If you're married, then it's Fard al-Ain for you to learn the basic knowledge of marriage. If you have camels, then it's going to be Fard al-Ain for you to know the zakat of camels. Okay, so that's why I said that what I had just said was silly. So anyways, the big takeaway, or the big message I'm trying to give to you, is that study more than what a basic class of Fard al-Ain tells you to study. If you are doing something in your life, go learn the fiqh of it. It's probably, we live complex lives, And Fard al-Ain books tend to be really simple so that they can cover the majority of things that most people do during their daily lives. And most of those books were written in the past, in centuries past. They don't necessarily cover what people are doing today. If you open a book of Fard al-Ain fiqh, is it going to give you the ruling of making wudu from a water tap, keeping in mind that most municipalities dump chlorine into the water and they dump fluoride into the water? Our Fard al-Ain books are written for an age that has passed. And so you're going to have to study more. And we're going to have to update our Fard al-Ain books. So anyways, I went way overboard what I wanted to do in the last segment, and I've also done a lot more in this segment than I wanted to do. So inshallah, we're going to stop now, and next time we're going to begin where Imam al-Nawawi talks about where we should recite the Quran. Okay, until then, I'll close by saying Wallahu alam, and Allah knows best, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.